Thank you. So I'm going to preface this by saying that this is something of an experiment, which might seem odd. I've done this before, at least tried to. I don't know if I succeeded the last time. I'm going to try it tonight, and you can tell me at the end if you think I succeeded. That's the first thing. Second thing, I don't normally think about, who am I honoring by a presentation. One could say I'm honoring C.S. Lewis. However, today is my grandfather's 102nd birthday. And he is a godly man who was a faithful pastor for his entire life until he was no longer able to see to read the scriptures. And even then, he was still asked to come and preach because he still had them in his memory and could still preach from the Word of God. And I was going to bring with me his copy of C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed, but I have too many books in my backpack already, so I figured I'll leave that one at home. So I say that I'm honoring my grandfather tonight, but through talking about C.S. Lewis, the Apologist. I thought, and I'm actually going to skip almost my entire first page, I thought I might start by saying, why in the world should we even study C.S. Lewis? And yet I suspect that if you're here tonight, it's because you already see the value of it, of his writings and of his work, and so you need no more convincing than anything I could actually give you. Certainly he was probably the most influential Christian apologist of the 20th century. So here's what I want to do tonight. I think that we find in C.S. Lewis something that is supremely interesting. We find in the life of C.S. Lewis the providence of God by which he prepared a boy, brought him into adolescence, brought him up to manhood, and through the experiences of his very life, prepared him to defend the Christian faith. In fact, to a certain extent, if you study his life and then study his apologetical arguments, you realize that some of his most important and interesting contributions to Christian apologetics were also about things that he experienced very deeply. Now, here's what's wild about that on top of it. C.S. Lewis always reminds us of the danger of what he called the personal heresy. That is, that we should be careful to not try and explain someone's ideas by pointing to their life history. Here's the thing, though. Here's what I want to try and do tonight. He has a theory about the Gospels and pagan mythology. And in his theory about the Gospels and pagan mythology, he approaches what he would call the Christ myth theory in an entirely different way from that the way in which it was approached by many other Christian scholars and apologists. A lot of times what they try to do is somehow show that the pagan myths were written years after the Gospels. And so, if anything, it's the pagan myths that copied the Gospels. What C.S. Lewis suggests is that God, in his providence, put into the world the very ideas that the pagans would discover and then put into their stories, thus preparing the pagan imagination for the coming of Christ. Divine providence preparing the mind through reality itself, of which people are a part. And so it crossed my mind that perhaps we could study C.S. Lewis and his approach to apologetics in very much the same way. So that's what I'll try and do tonight. And you guys can tell me at the end if I succeeded. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to study 3 interesting themes that C.S. Lewis approaches, both in Christian apologetics and that we see and we can trace through his entire life. Number 1, the problem of evil. Number 2, the argument from joy or desire, Sehnsucht. And number 3, the historicity of the Christ myth. In each section, what I'm going to try and do is give you selections from the life of C.S. Lewis, tracing his story, so you can see where these aspects come out in his life, and then we're going to look at how he approaches those different arguments. I'm going to try and do that all in about 45 minutes. Google says it's possible. So let's start. The life of C.S. Lewis and the problem of evil. Clive Staples Lewis was born in 1898 in Belfast, Ireland, into a family which had been Protestant for several generations. Despite the fact that he was born in Ireland, he always said that he was Welsh from Wales, where his great-great-grandfather had been born around 1775. An overview of his ancestors reveals the following. His great-great-grandfather, Richard Lewis, was a farmer from Wales and a member of the Church of England. Richard's son, Joseph, was also a farmer, but left the Church of England to become a pastor in the Methodist Church while maintaining a small farm. Richard Lewis, one of Joseph's 6 children, and Lewis's grandfather, was the first Lewis to immigrate to Ireland to work in a factory manufacturing parts for steamboats. Richard left the Methodist Church and went back to the Church of England. In 1868, Richard moved his family to Belfast to start his own steamboat parts manufacturing company, and his son Albert Lewis was born in 1863. Albert received a formal education at Lurgan College under the great Kirkpatrick, who would later become an important educator in the life of C.S. Lewis. In 1879, having finished college and having worked for a few different law firms, Albert started his own practice in Belfast in 1885. C.S. Lewis's mother, Florence Hamilton, was born in 1862 to Thomas Hamilton, who was a member of the clergy of the Church of England. Florence had received a good education, receiving a baccalaureate from Queen's College in Belfast, and she was excellent in mathematics, logic. She was extremely well read, and she was very good at multiple different languages. Lewis had an older brother, Warnie Lewis, who was 3 years more or less older than C.S. Lewis. And we can see their friendship traced right through his entire life. We won't do that tonight, but we could trace the influence of Warnie even on C.S. Lewis and the interactions they had through his entire life. There are 2 circumstances that took place during the childhood of C.S. Lewis that had a major influence on the formation of his character. First of all, Warnie, with whom C.S. Lewis had developed a very close brotherhood. Like we think about friendship, right? Close friendship. Warnie and Clive Staples Lewis had become very close, and Warnie was sent off to boarding school. This resulted in Lewis growing much closer to his mother, Flora. The second major event that happened in his childhood was the death of his mother. Flora, his mother, died on her birthday, August 23rd, 1908. He explains in his autobiography that his mother's death produced 2 completely different effects, one good and one bad. The good fruit was in a sense produced by the bad fruit. The most unfortunate result of his mother's death was that both of the Lewis boys became estranged from their father, who was entirely devastated by the death of his wife. He just didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to grieve. And he certainly did not know how to take care of 2 young boys who were also grieving the death of their mother. In Lewis's words, the death of his mother, quote, divided us from our father as well as our mother. Thus, by a peculiar cruelty of fate, during those months, the unfortunate man, had he but known it, was really losing his sons as well as his wife. The way that Lewis describes the emotional separation from his father, I think, is important because he describes it almost in the same way you would describe a death. He describes the loss of relationship with his father the same way he describes the loss of his mother through her death. The good fruit is that Clive and Warren grew closer than ever. Again, in his own words, he says, we were coming, my brother and I, to rely more and more exclusively on each other for all that made life bearable, to have confidence only in each other. Everything that had made the house a home had failed us. Everything except one another. Thus, at the age of 10 years old, if we listen to how C.S. Lewis describes his childhood, he finds himself stranded, alone. His only companion is his brother. He's lost father and mother. He's lost his home. Having no idea how to grieve properly for the death of his wife, and much less able to help his children, Albert sent not only Warnie, but young Clives at 10 years of age to a boarding school in England, an entirely different country, in 1908. Moving from one private school to another and then to a private tutor, Lewis eventually would apply to Oxford University. Despite the fact, this is something that for me is a huge consolation, Despite the fact that he failed his mathematics portions of the entry exam, I would be on the same page. He was still accepted as a student at Oxford. We're told partially because the Oxford University had not yet received the results of the test. So he was admitted into the university. He began studying, and then another tragedy hits. This time, not just in the life of C.S. Lewis, but worldwide. World War I. And C.S. Lewis, less than a semester into his schooling at University of Oxford is called to serve in World War I. I'm not going to read how he describes that experience. But if I were to try and, if you could read his descriptions of what it was like to see dead human beings lining the sides of foxholes, you'll understand a little bit of what he went through. During his first months of training as a soldier, he met Patty Moore, who shared a room with him. They became close friends. And Patty introduced him to Patty's mother, Mrs. Janie Moore, and his sister. Patty and Lewis, before going to the front lines, made a commitment to each other. If one of us dies, the other will take care of that person's family. Lewis was sent to the front lines on November 17th, 1917, not long before his 19th birthday. During that war, that winter, Lewis fell sick. He had a weakness in his lungs from a childhood, and that just affected him seriously. He spent several weeks in the hospital. It's worth noting, during those weeks in the hospital, in bed, he read G.K. Chesterton for the first time, who became a major influence in his life. He gained a huge appreciation not just for Chesterton, but for Christian authors in general. Thus, he makes a comment at one point: the young atheist can't be too careful about what he reads, because God's always throwing out traps. Lewis was wounded on April 15th, 1918. A grenade exploded not far from him. He was struck by 3 pieces of metal in his left hand, in his left rib, and his left leg. From what I've read from my readings about that, C.S. Lewis said that the piece that struck his side was never removed because it was too close to his heart. But the part that hurt him the most throughout his life was his hand. Even though it was removed, his hand bothered him for the rest of his life. While he was in the hospital recovering from that injury, he was told that his good friend Patty Moore, who had been missing for a month, had been confirmed dead. Lewis says that he finally converted from atheism to theism, not yet Christianity, but theism, in 1929, when he was about 31 years of age. One of the key events that led to his conversion was a discussion that he had with one of the firmest atheists that he knew. I'm going to come back to that later. He left this discussion by bus, and he doesn't give a whole lot of details about what happened. All he says is he got on the bus, and he was still an atheist. When he got off the bus, he now believed that there was a God. That's about all we know. There are some other details. I'll come back to some of those later. We're told that he converted to Christianity from a somewhat generic theism in 1931, a number of years later. Though in his own autobiography, he says a couple of months went by and then he became a Christian. In reality, people like Sayer, who have done research on this, suggest that it's actually about 3 years later that he became a Christian, 1931. In the years between his conversion to a generic theism and his conversion to Christianity, there was another major event that happened: the death of his father. Albert Lewis retired in 1928. Before I go on, it might be worth noting, he never had a great relationship with his father from the time that his mother died until the time his father died. Their relationship consisted of the very rare visit that C.S. Lewis did to see his father. His father never went to visit him in England. Occasionally, Lewis received money from his father to support him. And it's worth noting C.S. Lewis lived in almost abject poverty for most of his life until he was able to obtain a position. So his father, Albert, retired in 1928. In August of 1929, it was discovered that he was very ill. Turns out he had cancer. His mother died when he was 10 years old of cancer. The doctors believed that he would probably live for a few more years, but he died a month later, September 25th, 1929. From the 30s to the 50s, Lewis enters one of the busiest times of his life, publishing most of the works for which he is known. teaching and caring for the ailing Mrs. Moore. He never reneged on his promise to Patty. In 1940, Lewis published, by request, his most well-known interaction with the problem of evil, the problem of pain. I don't think it's his best interaction with the problem of evil. It's his most well-known. In 1950, another death, or within the following year. Mrs. Moore fell ill, and she died on January 12, 1951. She had been to him a surrogate mother. Joy Davidman entered Lewis's life the year before the death of Mrs. Moore in 1950. She entered his life via written correspondence, letters that they exchanged. And then she moved to England in 1952. Lewis claims that at first he had no romantic desires for Joy Davidman at all. He was fascinated by her intellect. And they became fast friends. In 1956, he discovers that he had, in fact, fallen in love with Joy when she was diagnosed with cancer. She was allowed to return with Lewis, and I should mention they were married in the hospital, civil ceremony. And she was allowed to return in early 1957 with the thought that she would die shortly thereafter. Her cancer went into remission. The same year that the cancer went into remission, Lewis was diagnosed with osteoporosis. In 1959, 2 years later, Joy's cancer returned, and she died of cancer on July 11th, 1960. If you ever get a chance to read his book, A Grief Observed, this is probably one of my favorite treatments of the problem of evil I've ever read. It is the most pastoral treatment of the problem of evil you'll ever read. It's raw. In that book, he talks about the fact that cancer has stolen from him everyone he loved, with the one exception of World War I, which stole the others. He had seen the death of his mother, his father, his wife. In A Grief Observed, he laments to God, why would you allow someone who had never any intention of falling in love, why would you lure them out of their cave as if with a lollipop, only to pull away the candy just as soon as they realized they had a desire for it? His life experiences, I would suggest, fed into his answer to the problem of evil, whereby he shows, through a number of different arguments, books, and articles, that the reality of evil does not demonstrate the non-existence of God. The traditional problem of evil could be summarized as follows. God is all-powerful, therefore he is able to answer and solve or defeat evil. God is all-knowing, therefore he knows how to defeat evil. God is omnibenevolent, therefore he wants to defeat all evil. Evil exists. Therefore, an all-powerful, all-knowing, omnibenevolent God must not exist. That's the classical argument for the existence of evil. And C.S. Lewis portrays that argument almost exactly the same in his work, The Problem of Pain. He leaves out simply the question of divine knowledge when he portrays that classical problem of evil. Now, there are a number of ways in which you can respond to the problem of evil. One way in which you can respond to the problem of evil is by denying that evil is. I just got a little book here on being. For the record, it's not about what it's like to be Plato. Like if you look at the title, On Being Plato. It's Plato on being. One way of responding to the problem of evil is to deny the being of evil. That there is evil, you could say. Now that seems counterintuitive, right, people, especially when you have suffered evil. It seems, if you look at the example of C.S. Lewis's life, that evil was very much existent in the presence of cancer in the lives of the people that he loved. And yet C.S. Lewis adheres very much to the classical definition of evil. That evil is nothing. It is parasitic on the good. Here's a quote from his article, Evil and God. He says, "If evil has the same kind of reality as good, the same autonomy and completeness, our allegiance to good becomes the arbitrarily chosen loyalty of a partisan. A sound theory of value demands something different. It demands that good should be original and evil a mere perversion. That good should be the tree and evil the ivy. That good should be able to see all around evil, as when a sane man understands lunacy, while evil cannot retaliate in kind. That good should be able to exist on its own, while evil requires the good on which it is parasitic in order to continue its parasitic existence. Evil's not something. It's the lack of something. If evil is an absence rather than being, if it is the lack of existence, then the argument from evil falls apart. Because one of the main premises is that evil is. And C.S. Lewis would rightly point out, no, it isn't. Evil is lack of being. It is lack of goodness. It is lack of beauty. It is lack of truth. Evil is not a thing that can be considered as being in any positive sense of the term. It is absence, privation, and perversion of good. That's the first way that C.S. Lewis responds to evil. The second way, well, there's two normal responses that we give aside from that one. One's a defense and one's a theodicy. In a defense, well, the most common one is like a free will defense. Here's how C.S. Lewis summarizes in The Problem of Pain his version of the free will defense. Creaturely free will is the primary cause of evil in the world. If God really wanted to get rid of all suffering, he would have to, in one way or another, remove free will from men. But it would seem that one would be losing a greater good, that is free will, in order to obtain a lesser good, the entire absence of suffering. And there are a wide variety of what we call defenses against the problem of evil. What I find more interesting in C.S. Lewis, however, is his theodicy. Throughout the history of Christian thought, there has been an approach to the problem of evil which we call the soul-making theodicy. It originates in the early church fathers, and we find it here in C.S. Lewis. In a theodicy, one seeks to show that and why God allows evil and suffering in this world. Not that evil makes sense. Because if evil is not being, if it's absence, if it's privation, it doesn't make sense. And that's actually what it is about evil that disgusts us. That abhors us. It's the lack of sense. So then why is it there? Lewis presents in many of his works The Problem of Pain, the Screwtape Letters, A Grief Observed, one of my favorite books of his, Till We Have Faces. He presents what we call a soul-making theodicy. And here's what he says. I'm going to give you 4 points here about how evil forms our soul. That is, God uses evil, pain, and suffering to make us into the image of his Son. 4 things that we draw directly from Lewis. There's maybe more, by the way. This is just C.S. Lewis. God uses pain and suffering to awaken us to and to reveal the hideousness of our sins. That's number 1. Second, I've got more here that I could give you. For the sake of time, I'm moving forward quickly. Secondly, God uses pain and suffering to remind us that we were not made for this world, but for a better and far superior land. Thirdly, God uses pain and suffering to teach us to persevere in the good, even when it feels like everything, even our own desires, are against us. He does say something like this: the full acting out of the self-surrender to God demands pain. He teaches us how to submit to God through suffering. And then in the Screwtape Letters, Lewis notes that God allows disastrous evils to happen to teach men to value true virtues such as courage, perseverance, and so on. In summary, God uses evil to form man into the image of his Son. That, I think, is C.S. Lewis's most helpful answer to the problem of evil. There is a lot more. And I would encourage you to read the books that I already referred to if you want to know more. C.S. Lewis and the Gift of Joy. Lewis tells us that when he was a young boy, he frequently experienced what he calls joy. Until the death of his mother in 1908. In 1908, he was sent to Wynyard School in Hertfordshire, England. According to his biography, his autobiography, he was absolutely miserable. And this school offered one of the worst educations he ever heard of. He says that during this time at this school, not only did he not experience joy, he entirely forgot about it. He goes on to explain that through this joyless desert in which he had traveled since almost the death of his mother, there was at least one moment of genuine joy towards the beginning of his time at Chartres. It was produced by the fact that his gaze fell upon the title of a story written by Richard Wagner, Siegfried and the Twilight of the Gods. And he had a moment of joy. It came, it disappeared. But he remembers it as if he could still see it. He says his memory was stimulated. Quote, and with that plunge back into my own past, there arose at once, almost like a heartbreak, the memory of joy itself. The knowledge that I had once had what I had now lacked for years, that I was returning at last from exile and desert lands to my own country. In the distance of the twilight of the gods, in the distance of my own past, joy, both unattainable, flowed together into a single, unendurable sense of desire and loss. And at once I knew, with fatal knowledge, that to have it again was the supreme and only important object of desire. In that moment he knew, this is what I need, this is what I want, more than anything else. Well, it'd be nice to say, in a good Hollywood movie, things would begin going better at this point. In fact, this is not what happened. This period of his life was notably difficult for him. In 1922, he finished the first study of his first program of studies, the Greats. He finished top of his class, but couldn't find a job. And in fact, from 1922 to 1927, he lived in almost abject poverty, looking for work and never finding it. One of the most brilliant men in England. No one wanted to employ him. He writes in his own journals that the variety of situations that I mentioned earlier pushed him in, not only caused stress, but pushed him towards the brink of depression. He did eventually come out of it. Let's return to his conversion. He says in his autobiography that there were 5 things that happened, almost sequentially, that brought about his conversion to theism in 1929. Step number 1, there was a new experience of joy which happened as he was reading Euripides' Hippolytus. He had a new experience of joy. Number 2, he had a new analysis of the experience of joy through a book that he read by Alexander called Space, Time, and Deity, which allowed him to rethink this experience that he was seeking and desiring so much. The third action was the realization that this new analysis of joy could easily fit into his current philosophical trend, which was a Hegelian idealism. We're not going to talk about that today, at least. The fourth action, which wasn't specifically related to joy, was the realization, Hegelian idealism doesn't work. Back then, people might not have been able to tell him that so readily, but today, I could have told him that. And so he moved on to a Berkeleyan idealism. The final move was the combination of 2 events. First, he read Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton, which presented him with a coherent and distinctly Christian approach to history. This was followed by that discussion I mentioned earlier with one of the most ardent atheists that he knew, who suggested to him something that we're going to come back to in the next section. He got on that bus, he got off that bus, and he was no longer an atheist. If we look at what contributed to his conversion from atheism to theism, it all turns around the experience of joy. And then you know what happened? Another experience of joy. One of the things I've always found interesting about the life of C.S. Lewis is he married the thing he so wanted. I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek. His wife's name was Joy. The argument from joy, sometimes described as the argument from desire, is arguably one of C.S. Lewis's most favorite arguments. We find it in many of his, in fact, I can't even name all of the articles that we find it in. We find it in most of his nonfiction writings. We find it all through his fiction writings. Almost every single book of fiction has an allusion to the argument from joy or desire. In Mere Christianity, he words it like this. Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. That, by the way, I'm not going to get into a full exposition of what that claim is all about, but that goes right back to Aristotle and is a statement that has been affirmed by Greco-Roman philosophers and Christian theologians, from Aristotle and Plato to C.S. Lewis. He says this: a baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. Here's the argument. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably, earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. In the sermon, The Weight of Glory, he begins by explaining that if we were made for heaven, the desire for our proper place will be already in us, but not yet attached to the true object, and will even appear as the rival of that object. He later says, if a trans-temporal, trans-finite good is our real destiny, then any other good on which our desire fixes must be in some degree fallacious, must bear at best only a symbolic relation to what will truly satisfy. One of my favorite things about C.S. Lewis is he tells us as Christians that we must live in a very interesting paradox. God gave us for us to partake of with thanksgiving good things in this world. And we are not to turn any of them into idols, but to remember that when we partake of them with thanksgiving, our minds are to be pointed towards the source of all goodness. These things show us what goodness is. They reveal to us desire, and then they point us to that which is good. And the only reason why these things can even be called good. He answers two questions that one might raise to this. If this is the case, then how come there are some who deny this experience? Lewis explains, quote, almost our whole education has been directed to silencing this shy, persistent inner voice. Almost all our modern philosophies have been devised to convince us that the good of man is to be found on this earth. When I was studying Aristotle and Plato for this book, for example, they came out, and other ones were going to come out afterwards, and then Martin Heidegger, I discovered that there was an equal but opposite tendency. For Plato and Aristotle, when they see that something is, they're amazed. For Heidegger, it's by looking at death. And in my writing on them, I described them as saying, for Aristotle and Plato, when they see being, it's like when you get up early in the morning and you see a sunrise, and you're blown away by its beauty. That's wonder. That's what our school systems, that's what our education is teaching us and trying to get rid of, to lose. We lose that childhood wonder. We lose the little bit of wonder that even we as adults sometimes rediscover on those very early mornings. Martin Heidegger and modern philosophy, if I could describe it, it's like a person, and I don't know if you ever had this experience, I have, so I know exactly what it feels like. It's not enjoyable. I used the word joy there purposely. It's not enjoyable. It's the experience of being lost in the woods at night, just as it's starting to turn dark. Like the sun was up, and everything was hunky-dory, and you're walking through that trail, and then all of a sudden the sun disappears. And you confront death. And for Heidegger, and for much of existential philosophy, that's where you discover existence. Note how opposite that is. It's not wonder, but fear. C.S. Lewis suggests we've been trained to lose wonder, the desire for joy. He's also asked why I think this desire is going to be satisfied. That's a great question. And his response is very simple. You're thirsty? That's no evidence you're going to get something to drink. You're hungry? One of the sad, evil facts of this world is that people do die of hunger every day. Natural desire doesn't mean that you will attain or acquire that which you desire. All it means is that that object, which is the object of a natural desire, exists. And so he says, quote, "In the same way, though I do not believe, I wish I did, that my desire for paradise proves that I shall enjoy it, I think it a pretty good indication that such a thing exists and that some men will." We do have a desire for what transcends nature. This is no evidence that you will get it. Finally, Lewis and the myth made fact. C.S. Lewis had a very interesting education, one that is unfortunately slowly but surely dying away. When I say education, I mean childhood, infancy, with his parents. This was an experience. One of the experiences he talks about is something that many young people will never see again. Growing up in a household full of books. This is how he describes his house. He says he is the product of endless books. My father bought all the books he read and never got rid of any of them. There's many people in that room, myself included, who can associate with that. There were books in the study, books in the drawing room, books in the cloakroom, books too deep in the great bookcase on the landing, books in a bedroom, books piled as high as my shoulder in the cistern attic, books of all kinds reflecting every transient stage of my parents' interests, books readable, books unreadable, books suitable. Sorry, got to change page here. I was just getting excited. Books suitable for a child, and books most emphatically not. And he says nothing was forbidden me. His parents loved books. And he grew to love books as well. And he grew to love myths. We're told that some of the books that he read in his youth include the stories of Beatrix Potter, the stories of Mother Goose. He read stories in the Strand magazine. He loved fiction. He loved mythology from a very young age. And on top of that, he wrote fantasy and myth from a very young age. Many of you may have heard of his youthful writings called Boxenland. In his autobiography, he explains that he came to a school at Chartres. He deepened his knowledge of Latin and English. However, during those years, he also walked away from the faith. He began to smoke at age 12, cigarettes. He lost his sexual innocence, and he lost his Christian faith. And during those years began calling himself an atheist. In his autobiography, he explains the circumstances which led to that final walk away from God. First of all, the general director of Chartres was a lady who became for him like a mother. His mother had died when he was young, and she filled that hole. She introduced him, though it may not have been voluntary on her part, to occult ideas, the ideas of spirits and powers. Secondly, he had learned as a child to impose impossible standards on his prayer life, such that he fatigued of it very quickly. Finally, he had been taught the classics of literature, Virgil and the great Greco-Roman and Norse myths. However, I would suggest he was not taught them well. He suggests that he came to have the impression that these religions were the natural fruit of man. And if these were the natural fruit of man, why think Christianity was any different? And so he walked away from Christianity. There's a sense in which, and by the way, he alludes to it in some of his writings, that his love of mythology was a road that led him away from Jerusalem. He actually says in one of his writings that that same road that leaves Jerusalem also enters it. And that's something that's very interesting about his life, is that that same road that led away was the same road that led him back. He remained an atheist till 1929, right back to that same point in his life. This is why I find these three subjects so interesting with the life of C.S. Lewis. One of the things that contributed to his conversion from atheism to theism was a discussion with one of the firmest atheists he ever knew. You want to know what he told them? This very firm, ardent atheist? It appears that Jesus Christ might have actually existed. He's actually a historical figure. That's it. And that shook C.S. Lewis, who up to that point, when he looked at Christ, thought he saw nothing but a myth. He discovered that Jesus Christ couldn't be a mythical character from some mysterious and ambiguous past. He must have really existed. God providentially guided Lewis through one of his great loves, mythology, to discover in mythology the myth became fact. The title of a really excellent article he wrote. Now, let me just quickly summarize the Christ myth theory. It's really simple. There's been a wide variety of versions. In fact, arguably, you could probably trace it all the way back to the 1st century. In the past 200 years, there's been about 2 different versions. One starting in German, with the German theologians and scholars, people like David Friedrich Strauss and Renan. And one more recent, you can buy these books probably on popular bookstores by Tom Harper, Marvin Mayer, and a number of other neo-atheists of our own time. In both of these theories, they say something along the following lines. When you read the Gospels, what you discover is that the authors of the Gospels, who most likely wrote 2nd or 3rd century, they copied all of these miraculous events from the stories of the pagan gods. The Gospels are no more history than the stories of Osiris and Horus, Heracles, Attis, Mithras, Tammuz, Thor, and others. C.S. Lewis responds to this Christ myth theory in a way that we don't see very often. If you read the writing of Ronald Nash or J. Gresham Machen, they will respond to this by the types of arguments I just already suggested. That the Christian Gospels predate the myths that the Christ myth theorists say they copied from. C.S. Lewis says this. This is my summary of his basic argument. The Gospel would be less credible if it weren't for the pagan myths which resemble, strangely enough, the historical accounts of the Gospels. Or, in a 3-word summary, in Christ the myth became fact. In this exact article, which has that title, he says this: as myth transcends thought, incarnation transcends myth. The heart of Christianity is a myth which is also a fact. The old myth of the dying God, without ceasing to be myth, comes down from the heaven of legend and imagination to the earth of history. It happens at a particular date, in a particular place, followed by definable historical consequences. Read John Chrysostom's work on Christ and how he glorifies the cross. And he says, up until Christ, the cross was a symbol of ignominy. I hope I pronounced that word rightly. Mm-hmm. From the time of the resurrection of Christ, it became something that we decorate our houses with, our churches with, that we wear as earrings, that we put on shirts. This symbol of execution, one of the most horrific executions, has become a symbol of hope. That's the type of thing that C.S. Lewis is talking about here when he talks about definable historical consequences. We pass from a Balder and Osiris dying nobody knows when or where to a historical person crucified under Pontius Pilate. We know when and we know where. By becoming fact doesn't cease to be myth. That's the miracle, suggests C.S. Lewis. For C.S. Lewis, these pagan myths could almost be said to play the same role in God's divine plan for the nations that the prophets and the prophecies played for Israel. He actually calls them pagan or heathen dreams. Why is that? Well, he explains it in his book, Miracles. He says this: in the descent and reascent, everyone will recognize a familiar pattern. A thing written all over the world. It is the pattern of all vegetable life. It must belittle itself into something hard, small, and death-like. It must fall into the ground. And in the northern states and Canada, then get covered by snow. After which, 6 months later, new life. reascends. C.S. Lewis points out, the resurrection is a theme that God put in creation. It didn't take, you didn't even have to have a fertile imagination to see it. I used to raise rabbits, and one time, one of my rabbits got away, and I learned very quickly, never let rabbits escape. One, they're hard to catch. Two, they tunnel. Do you know why rabbits are often associated with Easter? People always wonder this. Why do we have chocolate rabbits? That just seems so stupid. There's a really simple reason for this. The female rabbit gets pregnant. She tunnels underground pretty deep. You can't follow her. And then miraculously, a couple of months later, she reemerges with her progeny. It's a symbol. The early church and the medieval church saw this as a symbol of Christ's death, burial, and resurrection to new life with a new people. This is all throughout creation, says C.S. Lewis. It doesn't take a fertile, even a strong imagination to see it. And so it's no wonder that the pagans looked at creation and in attempting to explain it through their myths, stumbled upon the corn king who dies and rises for his people. The same themes we see in the myths and in the Gospels are first found in creation. Why? Because they are first found, says C.S. Lewis, in God, the Creator. Thus, one is getting behind the nature religions and behind nature to someone, capital S, who, capital W, is not explained by, but explains, not indeed the nature religions directly, but the whole characteristic behavior of nature on which those nature religions were based. For C.S. Lewis, those myths are so important because they point to Christ. They awaken the pagan imagination to the coming Christ. They prepare him, the pagan, to see God. C.S. Lewis says in Miracles, a little article, not the book, with him there are no accidents. When he created the vegetable world, he knew already what dreams the annual death and resurrection of the corn would cause to stir in pious pagan minds. He knew already that he himself must so die and live again. And in what sense? Including and far transcending the old religions of the corn king. In other words, C.S. Lewis is suggesting God didn't create the world randomly. God is provident and sovereign over all things, and he put into the very world that he created the things of this world. The gospel. He was such an ardent believer in the sovereignty of God that he saw a divine plan even in the pagan myths. They were not simply the corrupt creations of a pagan mind, but God's plan for the redemption of sinful man impressed upon nature itself and then glimpsed dimly by fallen man as they imaginatively sought to explain the mysterious world in which they found themselves. Rather than pointing away from Jerusalem, those myths actually lead to Jerusalem. Let's come to a conclusion here. During World War II, C.S. Lewis gained his reputation as a great apologist. He came to be called the greatest Christian apologist of the 20th century. He was featured in Time magazine. In the first year of this war, he wrote The Problem of Pain, published in October 1940. In August 1941, he began producing a series of lectures, which were broadcast on the BBC radio with the aim of encouraging people of England as they suffered through the war. Those lectures were eventually published into 3 volumes. I think I have all 3 of those volumes. And then they were eventually published into the very well-known and loved book, Mere Christianity. Around the same time, he also composed the letters that would become Screwtape Letters. They were published in The Guardian, an English magazine or newspaper, from May to November 1941, and then in a book in 1942. He also, at this time, talk about busyness, became the president of the Oxford Socratic Club and debated some of the greatest minds of England, including the great G.E.M. Anscombe, gaining him a major reputation as an important Christian thinker. He continued to teach and write and study, but began to experience health problems in June 1961. He improved a bit until July 1963, when he would be admitted to the hospital after suffering a serious heart attack and falling into a coma. He came out of his coma, returned to the kilns, and resigned from his chair at Cambridge. He died on November 22nd, 1963, the same day that President Kennedy was assassinated. Interestingly enough, if you read his letters, there's a small book, Letters to an American Lady, in which she asks if he's still alive, because there have been rumors circulating that he was dead, and he writes back to her and says the rumors have been greatly exaggerated. Rumors of his death had circulated before his death, and when he did die, no one knew about it until much later, because of the death of President Kennedy. In this lecture, we have considered how God sovereignly directed the life of the greatest Christian apologist of the 20th century, such that it would gravitate around the very experiences and passions which prepared him to provide some of the most interesting and powerful arguments in defense of the major truth claims of the Christian faith. I suggested at the beginning that Lewis might appreciate the exercise that we're doing, though he'd hesitate. Is this an instance of the personal heresy? I suggest that Lewis might actually appreciate this because we see in his life the hand of our sovereign God, not only bringing Lewis, in his own words, kicking and screaming into the kingdom to himself, but sovereignly directing his entire life to make him into an apologist of the Christian faith. In Lewis's life, we see an example of that soul-making theodicy we talked about. His life being formed through suffering into the image of Christ. We see the very human innate desire for God, awakened as a young child, experienced, almost extinguished by sin and evil, but ultimately leading him to the foot of the cross. And we can see in a variety of his life experiences the very same mythical descent and ascent that he saw in those pagan myths, preparing his mind and quietly pointing to the incarnation, death, and resurrection of the myth made fact. Fascinating reality that I think is worth thinking about, each of us individually, perhaps, is that though the details may differ, we may each, if we pay attention, discover that very same reality in our own lives. The sovereign God is ever at work. Thank you. I can take questions.
Yeah, Professor, glad to take a few questions if you have them.
I will say, if you're asking for specific dates, if they're not written down in my text, I don't know. Or I can do my best to guess. But do you have anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Can you define theodicy? I didn't quite understand.
Theodicy is the attempt to answer the problem of evil by explaining why God would allow evil in this world. So it's to a certain extent, it can sound like a very ambitious project. The answer that C.S. Lewis gives and Irenaeus gives in the early church is a soul-making theodicy. That is, God allows evil in our lives in order to form us into the image of Christ. That's the why. Why does God allow evil? To form us. Now, if I was giving an entirely different lecture, I have given a lecture years ago on the biblical answer to the problem of evil. And if I remember correctly, I found 6 different specific reasons in the scriptures why God allows evil. One of them, consequences of sin. That's straight up answer. The Bible says that. Another example, it's not for punishing someone. It's not even necessarily so that someone can learn something in their own lives. It's to point to Jesus Christ. Why was the blind man blind? So that Jesus could heal him, and that you would know that he's the Messiah. So, and there's other reasons. But that's what a theodicy is. It's saying, why does God allow this evil in our lives? The Bible gives many answers, and one of them is that soul-making theodicy. Yeah.
Thank you. This idea of evil being a privation of goodness, that it's non-being as opposed to being.
Yeah.
So something like a donut hole needs a donut in order to exist.
Sure.
Yeah, I was just thinking, if you think of Scripture, do you think though that's how Scripture describes evil as non-being?
Sure. Now, it depends. Non-being is a very philosophical way of putting it. In Scriptures, sin is missing the mark.
Yeah. But do you think Lewis's description of evil being that, do you think that's a scriptural idea?
I think it is something that you definitely find in Scripture. I don't think he drew it just from Scriptures. He was heavily influenced by Augustine. I recently had an amicable debate with some other C.S. Lewis scholars, and someone had made the statement, oh, he was definitely influenced by the Neo-Thomists. And I kind of pushed back and said, no, he wasn't. We came to the conclusion, we think he was primarily influenced by Boethius. And, of course, Augustine. And so those notions of evil as an absence of being or privation, those come specifically from Augustine and from Boethius, and then before them from Plato and Aristotle. Now, is this idea absent from Scriptures? Absolutely not. It is all throughout Scriptures. But you're not going to find the Scriptures saying evil is the absence of being. Like this, it's not a metaphysical treatise in that way. But is the idea there? Yes, and I think C.S. Lewis could have pointed to it if he wanted to. Yes. And I would say one of the places where we see it is that idea of missing the mark. It's the absence of the perfection that you should have, right? That notion of missing the mark. I have a compound bow that I love practicing with. For one reason, it's very calming to kind of just stand out in nature, and you have to calm your body, right, to be able to pull this back, hold it, and then shoot it towards that target. The only time that you actually successfully, if you can say, hey, I hit the target, I got it where it was supposed to go, is when it's dead center. Anything that's not dead center is an absence of perfect goodness. It's a privation. You've missed the mark. That's the idea we see in Scriptures. And that's the idea that we find in that metaphysical explanation of the absence of being. Yeah. Does that help? Great. So I hand go up over here. Yeah.
Too many thoughts or thoughts from Lewis around how he chose both fiction and nonfiction for his apologetic instruments, and how he used one or the other. Was that just a whim, or was there some real thought there?
Yeah, there have been debates on this in Lewisian scholarship. One theory, which I don't think is adopted by most C.S. Lewis scholars, but it has been proposed, is that after his debate with G.E.M. Anscombe on his argument from Reason Against Naturalism, in which she defeated him soundly. Now, let's be clear about this. He was one of the most brilliant minds in Oxford. He almost never lost a debate. Anscombe defeated him. And some scholars have suggested that it's after that debate with Anscombe that we see him withdrawing from philosophical apologetics and moving towards literary apologetics. There is some truth to that we do see more emphasis on literature after that moment, but I don't think that's because he lost. On the contrary, he was thrilled that Anscombe defeated him, because he had exactly the type of attitude that every scholar should have. If I'm wrong, show me I'm wrong so I can correct myself. The only thing he was frustrated about Anscombe, that debate with Anscombe, was that he was thinking, we're on the same team. Because Anscombe was a Roman Catholic, and so big house Christianity. And so he's thinking, we're on the same team against the atheists. Why are you criticizing me? Show me how I can improve my argument. Don't just tear it apart. That was his problem with Anscombe. And afterwards, for the record, he did revise his book Miracles and continued to write philosophical literature. Why did he write and put apologetics into literature? I think it's because he knew from his experience that mythology prepares the heart and the mind through the imagination to receive the gospel. And some people have said his work, Narnia, is supposed to be some form of metaphor or what is the...
Allegory?
Thank you, allegory, that's right. Some form of allegory. He emphatically says it isn't. For him, it's essentially a form of mythology. Because he wants, and he's very clear about this, he wants the infant to read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, to fall in love with Aslan. And guys, if you've read that book, right, you fall in love with Aslan. I fell in love with Aslan in the movie, too. It was just, this is awesome. And if you guys watch the movie, even if it's not as good as the book, when you hear that stone crack, you have shivers. running up your arms, right? Like, it's insane. And he wanted that child to read that, fall in love with Aslan, and then when they see Jesus Christ, to say, that's Aslan, he's been with me the whole time. That's why he wrote fiction, I think. I think, if I could add on to that, it's because he realized that it's all well and good. I can come up here, and we can as scholars and as theologians, and we can discuss ideas. We can discuss ideas all day long. Interestingly enough, it's the images, the metaphors, and the similes that really hit home. I've sometimes given this analogy in my class. As a theologian, we can talk about the just judgment of God, right? Or, using the words of Scripture, we can talk about the wrath of God falling from heaven upon the unrepentant sinner. Now, let me tell you something. At least for myself. Maybe I'm just weird. I'll take that. I'm very colorful, at least. The just judgment of God doesn't scare me as much as the wrath of God. We're talking about the same thing. And yet, the wrath of God is terrifying. Head for the hills, find a rock to crawl under. And I think that's what C.S. Lewis is doing. He's trying to awaken the imagination so that we don't just know the truths, but we feel them. And he does that beautifully, I think. That help with that? One more question? Okay, sorry. Yep.
Earlier you mentioned that God uses evil to shape us. He gave 4 reasons. One was to awaken us to reveal the hideousness of our sin. 2 was we were made for a far superior land. 4 was to teach us true virtues. What was number 3?
For that, I'll just run to my notes quickly. It's just going to be easier for me to tell you right here. 2 seconds. There we go. And number 3 was, he uses pain to teach us to persevere in the good, even when it feels like everything, even our own desires, is against us. It teaches us to persevere. How could I illustrate that? I've got a great story. If you guys don't mind a little story. I think C.S. Lewis would like stories. Last year, I've got 3 boys. All of them love playing soccer. And my oldest boy has started doing calisthenics. And he starts running, right? And so last year I was thinking, you know what? I like playing soccer. I played soccer when I was young. I want to play soccer with my kids. And so what I did was I told my boys, I'm going to start running so I can keep up with you guys. My first time out running, okay? I'm like, guys, I'm going to do a mile. This shouldn't be too hard. I played soccer last summer. This is going to be easy. 3/4 of a mile. I can see my house, and I'm stumbling. Hands on my knees thinking, someone come get me. I'm not going to make it home. Okay? That's suffering. I just about died. I crawled up the stairs to the living room, and I told my wife, I'm like, my lungs are going to explode. My heart wants to pump out of its chest. I'm just going to die right here. Suffering teaches us to persevere for a greater good. By the end of that summer, I could run 6 miles. I went out there 3 times a week. And that first week, everything hurt. I had to walk up the stairs to the classrooms. I decided to take the elevator a couple times for the first time in my life. It was like, nope, not doing it. He uses pain and suffering to teach us to persevere in the good, even when it feels like everything is against us. That's a silly example, hopefully a funny example, but that gets to the point, is that there's a higher good than this pain and suffering, and he's using that pain and suffering to teach us to persevere, to push through for that higher good, which is so much more valuable, so much more desirable. That help? Great. Yes.